I'm Dr. John Anene. I'm a professor here at the College of Central Florida. I want to welcome you to this session of 2018 Midterm Election Roundtable Discussion. Before then, we want to welcome our guest speakers, Honorable Susan Gill, Supervisor of Elections, Citrus County, Professor Steve Tauber, Professor from University of South Florida. They'll be leading our discussions today. Susan will speak on election security in Citrus County. Dr. Tauber will speak on voting rights, voter suppression, minority voting. And when we're all done, actually, as part of the roundtable, I will invite you to join the discussion, ask questions about the midterm elections, the implications, contribute to the discussion. Democracy is a celebration. We're glad we have a democratic system in this country. You need to see other countries, see how they're rumbling with their democracy. So this is a celebration of midterm elections. It's very significant because you talk about who controls the Congress and how President Trump succeeds or fails in his public policies going forward. Also, I want to acknowledge our faculty here who brought in their students. Acknowledge the students who are here also, and those from the community who are here. Thank you for being in our program. Susan Rice, please. Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today. The last time you asked me, I was tied up with election duty, so I wasn't able to come. But this time, this Monday morning, I am free. We start early voting in Citrus County on Friday. We are very, very busy in the office, as you can imagine, but I'm thrilled to be here because you are the future of our country, and I want to make sure that what my goal is today is to make you understand the process of elections from registration until we get the tabulation of votes and the whole security of the system, so you can feel comfortable, because there's so much information out there and disinformation, misinformation about what's happening in the election world that it sometimes drives me crazy. And I'd like you to be able to have the real truth on what's going on. And so I made a copy of this. This is actually on our website, on the front page of our website, because election security is so important. And I tell you, I've been doing this for 21 years. And since the 2016 election, the security of the elections has really just gone off the charts as far as how important it is. In fact, I now have a certificate from the University of North Florida on cybersecurity. That's something I never thought I would have, but we have to go forward, and as election officials, even though I'm not an IT person, I have to be making decisions and understand what's going on. So all of a sudden, we have to be somewhat of at least a management cyber understanding. So I want to start with voter registration. And voter registration, and this is in the state of Florida, as you know, you can get your driver's license and register to vote at the same time. What I hear out there sometimes is, oh, we have illegals voting and all this, and so I want to explain the whole process to you. So why, at least here in Florida, and at least here in Citrus County, I know that this is not happening. And that is, first of all, when you get a driver's license, which most of us I'm sure probably have, you have to provide documentation, right? And so that's number one. And so to get a driver's license, you have to show all this proof. And then the same thing when you're registering to vote, you have to show either or provide the numbers for a Florida driver's license, a Florida ID, or the last 4 digits of your social security number. So if you're not documented, then you don't have any of these numbers. So therefore, you're not going to be able to get registered. Because when you fill out a voter registration application, whether it be at the Driver's License Bureau or at the office or online, because now we have, as of October 1, 2017, you can now register online, change your party online, change your address online, as long as you have those numbers of a Florida ID, a Florida driver's license, and a social security number. That's the identification. They go up, that application goes up to Tallahassee, and they check and make sure that you're a real person. So that's the beginning of that. So I know you hear all about the fact that, that illegals are voting. Now, there are people in this country who do have driver's licenses who are not citizens, and they are legal immigrants. They're called legal immigrants. They've got a green card, and yes, they can get a driver's license, but they are not allowed to vote. Okay, that's for United States citizens alone. Also, you hear about the deceased voters voting. Well, as I explained to you the whole process here, you'll see that that's really not possible. Social Security Administration provides us on a daily basis with the people from our voting list who have passed away. And sometimes something is missed, and it's usually a loved one that's coming in with a death certificate so we can take them off the voter registration rolls. But when I go through the process of how a person would not be able to vote, they can't go to the polls because they need a photo ID, a photo and signature ID to prove that they are that person. And then if they don't have that, they have to do a provisional ballot with the signature being matched against what we have on file. So we have a lot of safeguards in there that would prevent that. And we also, in this state currently, have to remove felons who have not had their rights restored. That's Amendment 4 on the ballot. You need to be thinking about that as you go to the polls and study the amendments, because they are very far-reaching and they make an impact on our Florida Constitution and how we run our government. So you need to look at that. On our website, votecitrus.com, we have a guide which is nonpartisan. I have to be so careful about what goes on our website because we are the process people. We do not want to get involved in any politics. We want to give you the facts and let you make your decision. That's why we exist in the elections office. So, but there is a guide on there that will kind of explain the amendments to you, what it means if you vote yes, what it means if you vote no, and what the pros are and the cons, and what people are thinking about these, so you can hopefully make decisions. League of Women Voters has also a guide. Tax Watch has a guide, so you know you could check out those, and it is your responsibility to do that. And I hope as we go on here that every one of you in here that's here is planning to vote in this election. Because if you're eligible, because this election is all about turnout. So that means that if you stay home, then maybe the candidate you're talking about that you think is really great doesn't win because you didn't go out and vote. It is all about turnout, and that's what you got. This election is really very pivotal, and there's a lot of excitement out there. We are expecting a good turnout. But here, when you talk about turnout, in a presidential election here in Citrus County, we get about 76% turnout, somewhere in that range. The last election that we had in the midterms was in 2014, and it was really the highest in our recent history, and it was 61%. So you see, there are those people who only are going to vote in a presidential election. Don't you be one of those, because there's lots of things happening in this election that are very, very important. Okay, so let's go on here. So we're getting a notification about the people that need to be removed from the ballot. I'm sorry, not from the ballot, from the rolls. And we're very careful about that. Florida will be joining the ERIC project, which is Electronic Registration Information Center, and that's where there are many, many states within the United States that merge their voter registration data, and then we'll be able to find out whether we have some overlaps. Many people, and Florida is such a melting pot, we have so many people that come here, you know that, from all different states. And some of them they move, and they never think about changing their voter registration. They just, because, they just don't. And so they may be registered in another state as well as registering here in Florida. If we don't find out where they were registered to notify that jurisdiction, then they stay on the rolls up there. And it's not illegal to be registered in 2 states. It is, of course, illegal to vote in 2 states, but it's not illegal. And people are becoming more aware that they may still be registered in their former jurisdiction and letting us know. But this will help us to be able to have clean rolls, which are the backbone of a good election, are the voter registration rolls. So, all right, let's say we get to voting now. To cast a vote in a ballot in Citrus County, a voter must be eligible and registered with a residential address in Citrus County. You must present a current and valid form of photo and signature ID to vote. Now in Florida, this ID issue is a big issue, and I know Dr. Tauber will be talking about that. But in Florida, we've been, I think the legislature's been very liberal and right in putting a lot of voter IDs that can be used from a student's ID, not just a government-issued ID. And I think that that's why we don't have a lot of lawsuits about our Florida ID. They've added a couple that started in 2016, and that was a concealed weapons permit. People say, well, why can't I use my concealed weapons permit? And then also all sorts of employee ID badges that have their picture on it. So I think you can see that I think we've been very fair with the photo IDs. So you have to present the photo ID. And if a voter has never, has registered by mail and they've never voted in Florida, or they haven't been issued a Florida driver's license, Florida identification card, or social security number, they will be required to provide additional identification prior to voting the first time. And we have very, very few people who are in that category that would not have any of those IDs. For mail ballots, and this is really interesting because people really get confused about, and you hear all sorts of things about mail ballots. The voter requests a mail ballot, and then the voter must vote their ballot, and then they sign the envelope and return it to us. And the signature must match the signature that we have on file. And this is why your signature is so important. And the when we get this, the voter, when they request a vote by mail ballot, if they want it sent to another address besides the address that we have on file, they have to give us a written request. So therefore, we don't have somebody calling up, impersonating someone and having ballots sent to a location where the voter doesn't know. So we have that safeguard. Florida is a paper state, leaving a trail for every vote cast. And that's one of the most important things. Because for a while there, after the 2000 election, it really looked like we were going towards electronic voting. It really did. We had a system, which we still have the same system. We've never really had electronic except for people with disability. They had a touch screen until this last primary here. But they found out that voters really don't have confidence in these equipment without a paper ballot. So we always have the paper ballots, which we have to retain for 22 months, that we have as a backup. You can't argue with paper. You hold up the ballot. That's how the ballot was cast. That's the voter, the voter that filled out that ballot. It's not electronic. It's right there on a piece of paper. And once the voter checks in at the polls, or their mail ballot has been accepted, their record is marked as voted and will be flagged as already voted if they attempt to vote twice in the same election. So here's what happens. And what happened is that somebody arrives on election day, and because we have electronic poll books, then we can pull up their record, and it says, already voted by mail. And they're like, I didn't vote by mail. It happens at least once every election. Are these people, at least in my experience, trying to perpetrate voter fraud? No, they just forgot. Because we get the vote by mail ballots out pretty early. They went out October the 5th, the first huge drop of them. And then it comes election day, and they just have in their mind that they have to go vote. So what they would do is, if they dispute what we have to say, they complete a provisional ballot. A provisional ballot is just like a regular ballot. They complete it, but it goes into a provisional ballot envelope that's sealed, and they sign it, have their information on it, and then it goes back to the office. And then we have at the office 2 days to research that information. And we've gone through all our vote by mail ballots, just to prove to that voter that we did actually have, here's your envelope with your signature on it. And they're always like, oh gosh, that is my signature. So we haven't had anybody trying to do, perpetrate fraud. And then the voter is protected because suppose you show up at the polls and you don't have your photo and signature ID. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it, I left my driver's license at home. You are still going to be able to vote. You vote that provisional ballot. And once we change it, we look at that signature and then we match it to what we have on file, we count the vote. And I think, I can only remember like one time when the signature didn't match. So but it's a safeguard to make sure that nobody is taking their vote. The election, let's talk about tabulation and the tampering. Everything is under lock and key in our office. It's very secure. The elections office is in 24-hour camera surveillance. Doors and alarms are monitored, and we are equipped with motion sensors, should we not be there. And our state-certified voting equipment is rigorously tested before each election with pre and public logic and accuracy tests. What that means is that, and we just had our logic and accuracy test on Friday, we of course will test every one of those pieces of equipment that we have. And the way we test them is we have test ballots and we mark it with a predetermined result, and we put those ballots through every one of those machines and make sure that those machines are counting the ballots as they should. And then what we did on Friday, even after we've tested them all, we have a book they've tested and everything has worked out fine. We have what's called a public and logic accuracy test, and that's when we publish in the newspaper that anyone can come and observe what we're going to do. And what we do is we have the precincts, the 31 precincts and early vote sites, 4 early vote sites. We have all those machines there, and then they're randomly select. 10 of them are randomly selected for us to do a public test to show the public that in fact those machines are counting ballots correctly. So that took place on Friday, and we had 2 observers, and everything went fine. So it verifies that the equipment will accurately count and record votes as exactly as marked. And then we have security seals that are applied to all the voting equipment, and prior to their deployment out to the precincts, and it assists election officials with detection of possible tampering. So we know if there's any seals broken that we have to take certain steps to make sure that we put another machine there or something to make sure. Individual paper results are printed at each precinct and returned to our office on election night to verify and match against the electronic copy. This always brings to mind that people will say to me the day after election, boy, I guess you're glad that's over. It has only just begun for us because we have a reconciliation process that we go through, that we have to match up what came in from the polls, what came in over the telephone line, and all the precinct results are encrypted and electronically transmitted in a standalone server that has no connection to the internet, and that's what is used to tabulate and report the election results. So we have a tabulation room that's all locked up. It has limited access even to the staff. We only have certain staff members that can go in there. There's glass windows there, so if anybody wants to come and look and see what we're doing, they can. The thing about our elections here is they're very transparent. We want everybody to be comfortable with what we're doing. We're not hiding anything. And so those results come in to that computer, which is, like I said, it's used to lay out ballots, it's used to capture those results, and never connected to the internet. We have to take a thumb drive out of there to take it over to a computer to upload the results to Tallahassee, and then also to get it up into the internet onto our website to make sure we have to tell the world what the results are. And so that is done. Again, we keep the paper ballots for 22 months, and then we have afterwards a public manual audit that is required after each election. And what we have to do is we have to separate all the ballots by precinct. And then, which is not hard for election day ballots because we have specific people going in the precincts on election day. However, early voting, anybody can go into any of the early vote sites. And so and then also with the vote by mail. So we have to manually separate those. And then again, at a public meeting, one precinct is pulled out and one race, and we manually count those ballots to make sure to show that in fact the machine did count the ballots correctly. Okay, now we talk about our network security that we have. We purchased what's called an Albert server, which was placed online on May of 2018. And the Albert server monitors our network 24/7. So we have somebody looking at our network for any suspicious activity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and reports everything to us. So we can make sure, and they even report that, they look at everything, and our IT person many times is saying, oh no, this is okay, this is what we're doing, and but we see everything that's going on. We run a highly rated antivirus software and malware, and to ensure that desktop and servers are patched and up to date. And we have joined the Multi-State Information Sharing Analysis Center, which is called MSISAC, and it's also an election infrastructure information sharing and analysis center. And so we're in constant contact with them, and also with Homeland Security, because elections have been designated by the Department of Justice, I believe it was, Homeland Security, as a critical infrastructure. So that means that when something happens, DHS is right there. DHS has been a great partner for us through this whole thing, and they came and inspected our system. And this is really good because I have a really good IT person here in Citrus County, but a lot of those small counties, they do not have their own IT person. So they really appreciate the DHS people coming in, and then the state has cybersecurity navigators, and they come in and they help out and just check over everything and make sure that everything is fine, and so far we are. We have a firewall that blocks IP addresses that we're constantly updating, and then we have the policies for passwords and security of office equipment. And then this is really important, and that is the cybersecurity software in place for ongoing cybersecurity and phishing education for both full-time and temporary employees who are on the front line of cybersecurity. Because the person who is sitting in front of that computer and accepting emails and hitting an attachment, hitting something else, has to be educated constantly, because every day they're coming out with new scams, that to be aware, to be much more aware than we ever were of whatever we see that looks suspicious in any way. So that's some of the ways that we are we're getting very secure, I think, in Florida. So I'm going to take down here and let's see.
All right, well, hello everyone. As Dr. Nene said, I'm Steve Tauber, and I am a professor at the University of South Florida in Tampa, and I'm the chair of my department. We're called the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies, which includes political science, which is what I am as a political scientist. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to John and to Susan. I'm going to talk a little bit more historically and generally about voting rights, a little bit of a history on voting rights, and then some of the current controversies. And specifically, although not exclusively, but specifically I'm going to be focusing on voting rights as it pertains to racial and ethnic minorities, where there's been a long history of discrimination and legislation that's been designed to help ensure that minorities have the right to vote, and then some recent issues that have been occurring. So what I'm going to start with, of course, is before the Civil War. And so obviously this is basic American history. Everyone knows that before the Civil War, when the United States had slavery, state governments determined by themselves, with no federal interference, the civil rights of individuals living in the state. So obviously, as I think most of us know, that during this period, many states in the South and in the border areas, a lot of states that didn't secede, like Maryland and Missouri and Delaware, had slaves. Other states didn't. But what's important to understand is even in the free states up north, like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, that were strongly anti-slavery, those states did not permit African Americans to vote. In fact, during this period, women were not allowed to vote either. And even in the early republic, right after the framing of the Constitution, every state had a property requirement to vote. That you had to pay a certain amount of tax on your property to be eligible to vote. By the early 1800s, states did away with the property requirements, but they did not do away with the prohibitions against African Americans and against women. In the West, which the entire kind of bottom third of the country from California, drew a line from California, Wyoming, down to Texas, that was once northern Mexico. After the United States conquered that, and there was a treaty to settle that war in 1848, and those parts of Mexico became parts of the United States, Mexican Americans living there were not permitted to vote, as well as in the West. By the end of the 1800s, there were a lot of immigrants from China and Japan, and they were not permitted to vote as well. So most states denied people the right to vote based on race and gender. After the Civil War, there was the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which the Section 1 is quoting there. Rights of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, the 15th Amendment supposedly, or at least it was designed to end racial discrimination when it came to voting. But the history of that period, so this amendment was ratified in 1870, that history between 1870 and almost an entire century after that was one of continued discrimination when it came to voting and race. So the promise of the 15th Amendment wasn't realized, and as we'll see, there's still questions today. So, what did states do? So one thing states did is they had what's called a literacy test. That if you could demonstrate to the voting registrar that you can read, then you were able to vote. And the reasoning behind this presumably was that if you can't read the ballot, you shouldn't be able to vote. Although I should point out, even today in countries where there are high illiteracy rates, voting is done by symbols or colors, so you still know what party or what candidate you're voting for based on symbols or colors if a large proportion of the population couldn't read. But let's leave that aside. Presumably, a literacy test doesn't have anything to do with race. If you're black and you can't read, you can't vote. If you're white and you can't read, you can't vote. If you can read, you can't vote. But the problem was how these tests were administered. So first of all, states would institute what are called grandfather clauses, which said that if your grandfather could vote, then you did not have to take the literacy test. Now, if you're talking about, let's say, 1880 in a southern state, white people's grandparents probably could vote, whether they could read or not. Black people who are now free, they're not slaves anymore, their grandparents were slaves and obviously couldn't vote, so that grandfather clause obviously didn't apply to African Americans, but it applied to whites. Also, the tests that were given were very different. So for a white person, they might be told to recite the alphabet, which isn't that difficult. The tests that were given to African Americans were extremely confusing. It's not coming up too well, but this is an actual copy of the literacy test from Louisiana. And so this one, number 20, is my favorite. It says, spelled backwards, forwards. It's purposely confusing. You know, I have a Ph.D., and it took me a while to figure out exactly what that meant. And that was done on purpose so that it would deny African Americans the right to vote. So literacy tests were instituted, keeping African Americans from the polls. Then you have what are called poll taxes, that in order to vote, you have to pay a fee. So it seems like that makes sense. As Supervisor Gill explained, her office has a lot of staff and a lot of computers. I mean, they didn't have computers back then, but still had a lot of money going into running an election, so people who vote should pay for it. And again, it seems like it's racially neutral because you pay the tax whether you're black or white, you pay the same tax in order to vote, you pay the same fee. But Of course, African Americans were much poorer than whites, so many African Americans in the South could not afford the poll taxes. And even to make matters worse, what would happen is if an indigent white who could not afford to pay the tax showed up, the registrar would pay that person's poll tax out of his own pocket, but not extend that same courtesy to African Americans showing up to vote. And so poll taxes were designed to, despite the 15th Amendment, disenfranchise, meaning not allow African Americans to vote. Then, for the few African Americans who could pass the literacy test, who could pay the poll tax, when they showed up to vote, they were met with basically what is a terrorist organization, which is the Ku Klux Klan for the most part, who would physically intimidate African Americans coming to vote, and therefore preventing even the few that were able to get registered and able to vote from actually casting a ballot. And the states did nothing to prosecute the African American, the Klan's people from infringing on the right to vote, even though statutes at the time explicitly forbid it. It was a criminal offense, and it still is, to intimidate someone from who's showing up to vote. But the southern states never prosecuted those crimes. And when the federal government tried to do it, the Supreme Court said the federal government lacked that authority. So you had all of these problems keeping African American voting and Latino voting as well down, and especially in the South and in the West. And it wasn't until 1965 when federal legislation was passed to really clean up the problems and the malfeasance that were keeping African Americans and other minorities away from the polls. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did a lot of things. The first one is that it ended literacy tests, just banned them. You can't have literacy tests anymore, and that clearly alleviated that problem. Now, it did address the poll taxes. That was actually a constitutional amendment that addressed poll taxes. So now the Constitution says you can't have poll taxes, which is why you don't have to pay to vote, and all of the money that goes into operating elections is paid by the government for the citizens. So that's not part of the Voting Rights Act, but the Voting Rights Act did end literacy tests. It also provided a legal avenue for anyone who believes that their right to vote has been taken away, that they've been disenfranchised. They can then file a claim in federal court under the Voting Rights Act. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. Also, what the Voting Rights Act did, and I'll show you a map about this in a second, is it identified certain regions of the country, primarily in the South, but a few other places as well. And in all of these regions of the country, these were identified as areas with a history of voting discrimination, and these areas were not allowed to make any changes whatsoever in their voting system without first pre-clearing it with the federal government, specifically through the Department of Justice. So for example, although Citrus County wasn't one of them, I live in Tampa, I live in the city of Tampa, so Hillsborough County is one of these covered jurisdictions, had a long history of voting discrimination. So if they wanted to move a polling place across the street or change the times of voting, let's say closing the polls a half hour early, they could not do that unless they went to the federal government to pre-clear it, and the federal government would make sure that it wasn't designed to take away minorities' rights to vote. It's a very powerful part of the Voting Rights Act that basically said for some regions of the country, your history is so bad that you're essentially, the federal government has to double check anything you do and make sure you're not trying to discriminate against racial and ethnic minorities. Some amendments to the Voting Rights Act in 1975, the Language Minority Amendment was passed, which says that if a certain number of people in an area don't speak English as their native language, then the ballots have to be printed in that language. And so I was talking before with Supervisor Gill that Citrus County, because and other counties in Florida, because of the evacuees from Hurricane Maria, have now a large number of Spanish-speaking people, so ballots have to be in Spanish. I grew up in Los Angeles. Los Angeles has so many different languages spoken not just English and Spanish, but Korean, Vietnamese, certainly after the Vietnam War, that ballots have to be printed in all of these different languages. And that's so even if people don't speak English and they're still citizens, they have the ability to vote. And finally, in 1982, the amendments were required in the Voting Rights Act that would require states to draw districts that would have a certain amount of racial and ethnic minorities living in them. They're generally called majority black or majority Latino districts. So for example, in South Florida, where there's a heavy Latino population and heavy African American population, congressional and state legislative districts were drawn that would have at least 50 or 60% black or Latino people living in there in order to ensure that blacks and Latinos would be elected to government. So let's see what the effect of the Voting Rights Act was in terms of helping end discrimination for voting. So first, here's a map that shows the jurisdictions that are covered in pre-clearance. So all of these areas in red, all those entire states, the tiniest change had to go to the federal government to be approved. And you can see in Florida, Citrus is clear, but Hillsborough, Pinellas, Pasco, some of Southwest Florida were covered because Hillsborough had a very significant history of voter discrimination. And so in Hillsborough, for the longest time, again, polling place gets moved across the street, seemingly minor change. The federal government has to ensure that that change is not going to impact racial and ethnic minorities. Second, increased voter registration. So here's 7 states: Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. The orange line is a percentage of African Americans who were registered to vote before the Voting Rights Act. The green line is the percentage after the Voting Rights Act. And so in Mississippi, about maybe 7 or 8% of African Americans were registered to vote before the act. After the act, it went up to 60%. In other words, the act helped get African Americans registered where they weren't being allowed to register before. It also increased minority representation. This is for the numbers of blacks and Latinos in the U.S. House of Representatives. So even after the act was passed, but this is really about these 1982 amendments, there were, I think, about 13 African Americans in the U.S. House of Representatives. Remember, the 435 House members, 13 of them were black, 5 were Latino, and look at how over time that has increased, where now there are 46 African Americans, so a little more than 10% of the House is African American. The population of African Americans in the country is about 13%. Latinos, it's about 34 Latinos in the House. That's still below where they are in the population, but again, a marked increase in the number of African American and Latinos in the U.S. House of Representatives. And if you did the same thing for state legislatures, particularly in a state like Florida, you would see the same thing. What I want to finish with, though, is some of the backsliding that's occurred really since the beginning of this decade. And so there were tremendous advances from the Voting Rights Act, tremendous increases in minorities voting, making a difference in policy, tremendous increase in the number of African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans elected to positions of importance. But there have been increased restrictions in the past few years that have been either intended or unintended, isn't as important, but the effect has clearly been to lower and disenfranchise African Americans. So first, and Commissioner Gill already kind of alluded to this, one of the reasons that states have used for enacting these restrictions is that they're concerned about voter fraud. And then Commissioner Gill, Supervisor Gill did a good job, I think, explaining that it really doesn't happen, that the kind that they're talking about is you go and vote for somebody else, or vote, a dead person going in and voting. So here, this is for a decade or so in the beginning of the 2000s, there were 9 possible instances of voter impersonation, somebody claiming to be somebody else to vote and commit fraud. During the same time, you had 352 deaths by lightning. Unfortunately, a lot of those are here where we live. 32,299 UFO reports. So you had 32,000 people saying they saw a UFO, 9 people that said that they were somebody else when they went to vote, and even those weren't confirmed. So there really isn't a problem with voter fraud, but that's the reason for these restrictions. And so let's see what some of these restrictions are and how they impact minority voting. Probably the most significant was a Supreme Court case called Shelby County, which is in Alabama, versus Holder, who was the Attorney General in the Obama administration. And in this court case, what the Supreme Court said, and it was a very narrow decision, 5-4, the Supreme Court said that that idea of pre-clearance, with some parts of the country being forced to have to go to the federal government to make changes, but not others, that was fundamentally unfair to those regions that have to go to the federal government. And it invalidated the formula that was used to determine those specific regions. And so now these regions with a history of voting discrimination, like Hillsborough County, although Hillsborough County wouldn't do this anymore, but some other states we see will, is that they don't have to get permission to make changes. And they can make changes that might impact minority voting, but now they'll be allowed to make those changes because they don't have to get permission from the federal government first. Now, someone could always sue after the fact under the Voting Rights Act, but often that could be too late. And so in these dark red states, as soon as this decision was announced, these states made a number of changes to voting that made it more difficult for people to vote, made it more difficult for minorities and young people to register to vote. And they were able to get away with it because they didn't have to get it pre-cleared by the federal government. So some of these changes are limiting early voting sites and the number of days for early voting. So we're talking about early voting before. Early voting is a good way to vote so that you don't have to stand in a long line. Now, in Florida, what happened between 2008 and 2012, in 2008, we had Republican Governor Charlie Crist, who wanted more voting. He's now a Democrat. He's actually a representative out of St. Pete. But at the time, he was a Republican governor. He wanted more voting sites, early voting sites and early voting days. And the 2008 election, while there were some long lines and some problems, it was manageable. 2010, after Rick Scott got elected, again, another Republican governor, Rick Scott, and this is to show it's not necessarily partisan because he had 2 Republican governors taking different approaches, Governor Scott and the legislature restricted the number of early voting sites and early voting days, and this is a line from a precinct in Florida on election day, and you can see how long that line is. It goes all the way back there. Now, this is in the morning when the site, people were waiting for it to open. The lines were not quite as bad in the middle of the day, but imagine if you are working an hourly wage job and you want to vote and you go vote on voting day because you didn't get a chance to vote since they cut the early voting. You might not be able to wait in that line and still get to work. Now, in a lot of countries, voting day is a national holiday. Everyone gets the day off. That's not what we have in the United States, and so if you have to work and you show up, or you have maybe in the afternoon you have to pick up your children from daycare or from school, you might not be able to wait in that line, and therefore you can't vote. Second are voter ID laws. Now, Florida's voter ID laws are pretty fair, but a lot of states do not have very fair voter ID laws. So, in the state of Texas, a concealed handgun license is valid to show up to vote. A student ID is not. And even student IDs issued by state schools like the University of Texas is not valid to vote in the state of Texas. And if you think about for students, and this may be true here, although certainly many of you will go on somewhere to a 4-year or to one of the state universities where you're not going to necessarily be living close to home. So let's say there's a person who grew up in El Paso, registered to vote when she was 18 in El Paso, goes to the University of Texas, which is in Austin, which is the other side of the state. It's a very big state, so you're 1,000 miles away from home. They're not necessarily going to be able to show up and vote in Austin because that student ID isn't valid, and they might have to go back to vote in El Paso, and obviously you can't do that while you're in school. Now they might be able to vote by mail, but the problem, of course, is by not accepting student IDs, students and young people are being disenfranchised. Also, a lot of the forms of identification are ones that minorities might not necessarily have. So driver's license, a lot of people don't drive, especially in the urban north. People don't drive, you don't need a car. A lot of people never learn to drive, they don't have a driver's license. Or a passport. A lot of people don't have the means to travel abroad, they might not have a passport. And so these ID laws can and have in fact disenfranchised minorities and young people as well. Turning away voters. So recently in Georgia, this was just last week, they had opened up early voting, and a bus was organized to bring a number of elderly African-American voters to an early voting site. And the bus was turned away, and they were told that the bus can't bring people to vote. The reason the county used is seemingly valid, which is that you can't have party organizations operating at the site of where people vote. So when you vote, if you've gone to vote yet, I know where we go vote, which is in a church right down the street from us. You go to the parking lot, there's signs, there's people holding signs, but once you get certain distance or proximity to where you actually go in and vote, you're not allowed to have campaigning going on. The county here argued that this bus had to have been supplied by the Democratic Party to bring these people out to vote, and therefore was violating that principle. Even though that wasn't the case, now these people were able to vote, that's why they're high-fiving each other eventually, but the state of Georgia made it more difficult. Georgia, like Florida, has a very close governor's race, and it also features an African-American running for governor, like in Florida. So African-Americans might be more likely to turn out to vote in Georgia and Florida, but in Georgia they were met with this kind of resistance. Another issue concerns indigenous tribes or Native Americans, and this is something that in Florida we have too, and Supervisor Gill mentioned this, that in order to register to vote, you have to have a valid street address. Well, the problem for people who live on tribal lands and in tribal reservations is that there aren't street addresses. Instead, they're post office boxes where people get their mail. They go to the central place where the post office boxes are, and that's where they get their mail. But they live in very rural areas. So this is from North Dakota. Very rural areas that don't really have street addresses. A lot of it's dirt roads. And the requirement that they have to have a street address meant that a lot of Native Americans were not allowed to vote. This went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, all the way the federal court sided with the state, saying you have to have a street address, even though the people living in the tribal land said, but we don't have those by design. Basically, the response was too bad. And so now what they're trying to do is scramble in North Dakota to assign street addresses to people who want to vote. And this is important because North Dakota is experiencing a Senate race that's pretty close. There's a Democratic senator who's being challenged and pretty significantly. And the tribal people coming to vote, the people living on Native Americans living in the tribal lands going to vote, could make the difference in the race. So if they're not allowed to vote, then that would be a problem. And it was the Republican legislature that made this rule, which the argument was it was designed to keep possible Democratic voters away. So the ultimate conclusion is that I think for all of us, regardless of your party or your ideology, we should all be concerned about barriers to voting. Voting should be made as easy as possible. And actually, Florida has done a good job. Citrus County certainly has done a good job making it as easy as possible for people to vote. But in a lot of the United States, it's not easy to vote. Things have been made more difficult for young people, more difficult for African Americans and Latinos, and that's a problem, and I think that's something that should concern us all. So anyway, thank you, and I'm happy to join the panel and answer questions.
Into the roundtable now. So let's see the questions you have for the panel.
I have a question. Anybody behind me? When you were talking about the student IDs for like universities, they might not have driver's licenses and stuff. Supervisor Gill, you said that they just need to like the last four of their social. Does that not work in every state, or do you have to like have a driver's license plus like proof that you're an American citizen?
It's more the social security number, because everybody is issued a social security number, so the driver's license, the student ID had to do when you showed up to vote at an early vote site or on election day. That's when you would be using that ID. But to actually register, you do need those numbers, except in individual cases, there is a box that we can check off that says, I don't have any of those, and they're handled on a case-by-case basis, because it doesn't really happen very often at all. Usually someone has one of those numbers. That answer your question?
Thank you.
How would you handle a case where nobody has identification for like to vote?
Handling the situation with no photo ID, very simple. The voter just completes a provisional ballot, which is the same ballot that they would if they were voting with an ID. It goes into a pink envelope, or it's pink here in Citrus County, and that's called a provisional ballot envelope. It's sealed, and the voter fills out the information, name, address, and signs it. That comes back at the end of the day. It's not tabulated at that moment. It comes back to the elections office, and there's 48 hours for us to investigate. And that's a simple case. We put those right aside. That's real simple, because all we do is take a copy of your voter registration signature, and as long as it matches what's on that envelope, we count that vote. Provisional ballots are also used more complicated situations when somebody's registration is in doubt, or their right to vote is in doubt. We've had people that just show up and they're not eligible because maybe they moved from another state and they didn't register in time. That's one. We've had some addressing issues that we've had to work out, some challenging things, but we work it out because our main goal is to count every legal vote. We really want that to happen. And so we're not looking at ways to disqualify people, we're looking for ways to qualify people. So that's how that simple situation with the voter ID would work.
How do you think Hurricane Michael is going to affect the voter turnout in the Panhandle with, like, I know the addresses and such and everything, but how do you think that situation is going to turn out for voter turnout?
I think it can't help but affect it. I mean, when you look up there, the supervisors up there are doing everything humanly possible. When we have hurricanes, which we have a history of it right around election time, I have to go back to 2004 when we had 4 of them come through the state, and we all pulled together. One of my staff members and I did poll worker training down in Hardy County because Hardy County is a small county, 3 people in that. I called down there right after the election, and I spoke to the assistant, and he said, "Oh, it's just terrible down there, but that's not the worst." And he said, well, I said, "What is the worst?" The supervisor was cutting a tree and he died. He had a heart attack and died. So the state, our association, pulled together to help us. What's happening up there in North Florida now is very the same thing. Fortunately, the 8 counties that were affected, their equipment was not affected. That's amazing. So, because there was an effort to pull out like, hey, who's got, of the supervisors, who has equipment that they might be able to use if you have some extra equipment. And so, we had some of the larger counties, we don't, because we don't have a lot of equipment to be able to do. I'd love to, but we don't. So they're getting set. I just put something in the newspaper that we got about anybody that might have evacuated here from Bay County. Now they're up and running to the fact that they can accept ballots, the vote by mail ballot requests, and they're accepting mail. And what they're going to do is they'll set up really what amounts to vote centers. And that will mean it'll be like early voting, that anybody can go to them. So they're in the process of doing that and pulling things together. But, there are going to be some people, let's face it, who are just going to say, I've just got too much going on here. I don't have a house, I have nothing. I mean, they're traumatized if nothing else. So I think it's going to affect it. But the supervisors and the state are just doing everything they possibly can to make it happen, and it will happen.
And to add, so the governor also extended early voting there into those counties that were hit. And it's unfortunately based on when elections are held, where we live, when hurricanes tend to hit. In Florida, it's not the first time. So in 2016, when Hermine and Matthew, the governor had to extend the registration deadline because people might have been registering, and that's when the hurricanes hit and they weren't able to. And I wasn't living in Florida in 1992, and even though Andrew hit early, I think Andrew had some effect on voting, and that's still the worst hurricane to hit, in at least in our lifetimes, and that was in a very populated area. One of in the areas that were hit this year is not as populous, but again, it's very important that everyone be given the opportunity to vote, and not let the natural disaster get in their way. But unfortunately, I think, because it was so devastating for so many people, it's not on the top of their minds. And that there's nothing anyone could do, maybe just encourage people to vote, and, hopefully as many people who were intending to vote do vote.
Yeah, and just to talk a little bit more about that, there was an executive order by the governor that laid out exactly what could happen. And some of those safeguards that I talked about, for example, if somebody was requesting a vote by mail ballot and they were going to a different address, it'd have to be written. He said, no, we don't have to do that. I mean, we don't have time for that. And if this is, let's make this as easy as we possibly can for the people up there. And so they're just working the best they can.
Thank you.
Is there a reason that they require the address, the street address? Is it like a district being where you can vote problem, or?
That's exactly it. You're going to be registered at a residential address, so you can be in a polling precinct, and then it goes further to the district, so you will be voting for the people that you're entitled to vote for. So, for example, we have two cities here, Inverness and Crystal River, and so we have two precincts, and the people that live within those precincts, and they're the city voters. But we don't, if you're living not in the city, you don't have the right to vote.
And, but in North Dakota, though, where the tribal reservations are, it's clear where they live, what their districts are in terms of, they're all in the same district for state representative and county commission and things like that. So that wasn't as much of a concern. Now, in general, yes, it makes sense why you would need an address. But in that case, probably there should have been some sort of consideration made for the people living in the tribal lands, and there wasn't. And I think that was on purpose to make it more difficult for voters to vote the way that the people who control the legislature at the time didn't want to vote. And it's not a partisan issue. When Democrats control legislatures, they will try to do the same thing. So it's not that it's just something Republicans do to Democrats. All parties do that as a way to maximize their chances of winning, which is why I think it's good that in Florida that we've tried to depoliticize elections as much as possible, and haven't suffered as much as what you see in some of the other states. That's because of the good work of the election commissioners. Even though I don't think election commissioners should be partisan offices, they are, but they all do a good job keeping their party out. Our Hillsborough is a very Democratic county, so our commissioner of elections is a Democrat, but he, when it comes to running the elections, he does not favor the Democrats at all.
Absolutely. You know, in the 2000 election, it was very obviously contentious, and it was my first presidential election. I thought, oh, so this is what it's like. But I remember getting calls, and you know, people would say from the parties, well, your canvassing board, which maybe I could talk a little bit about that. The canvassing board are they Republican or Democrat? And I was thinking, I don't even know. I mean, I don't hire people by their political party. I don't, you know, the canvassing board we don't make up by their political party. You know, we're in there with the process people, and it works, in my opinion, best when that happens. The canvassing board is in Florida law, and the canvassing board is made up of a county judge, a county commissioner, usually the chair, and the supervisor of elections. Now, what do? They make decisions about elections. For example, the provisional ballots, and the majority rules. Does that signature match? Okay, what's the situation with this provisional ballot? You know, we're going to vote on it 3-2. And I'm responsible for running the election, the administration of the election, but when it comes time for making decisions on ballots, being there for the logic and accuracy test, being there, signing the certification, the canvassing board is what is the deciding factor. Not so in other states. Sometimes it's the parties, which you can imagine can get a little contentious, but I really like the way that that Florida has set up elections. And as you can see from, you know, just talking about the Indians, the Native Americans and such, there's so many different situations out in our world that have to be looked at. And every situation's not the same. They've got a very, you know, specific situation. We've got people with disabilities. We've got language issues. We've got a transgender issue. We have everything in our society that, you know, we want to be able to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to vote. We don't care what their situation is, as long as they're eligible to vote, of course.
A good thing, you're all too young to remember or maybe not even around during the 2000 election, but if you Google and you want to look at sort of a canvassing board, in those days you used to vote by punching a hole into a ballot that you would put in, and then you punch the hole next to the person that you wanted to vote for. So there you could go and you could see the video of the canvassing board trying to figure out, like for example, if the hole wasn't all punched all the way through, was the indentation enough to signify that the person intended to cast that vote? And you could see the canvassing board literally holding the ballots and looking at with a magnifying glass to see whether there's enough of an indentation or not, to see how, you know, and in that case it made the difference as to who was president of the United States, not just the outcome in Florida, and to see how, you know, in these rare but usually occurring cases, how it comes down to human judgment ultimately to make these decisions. And, you know, in close elections, and Florida is a close election state, almost like all our elections, governor and president really since 2008 have been very, very close, and those decisions matter, and it comes down, a lot of it comes down to human judgment, and that's why it's important that the humans doing the judging do it in a way that they're doing it to be fair, not because they have a certain party they want to win. And you know, obviously 2000 was a big problem for a number of reasons, but I think Florida's done better than most states in keeping it that way.
Well, I know that we are the leaders in cybersecurity in the country. I mean, we really stepped up on that, take it very seriously, and the state has put a lot of money into it. We've actually got grant money actually from the federal government as well. So everybody is very serious about that. And
I'll put a plug in USF. If you're interested in cybersecurity, USF, UNF I'm sure is good, but USF, I'm going to put a plug in for USF's cybersecurity program. If you're interested in a field that is both computer-oriented and has effect on people's lives, and especially if you're interested in politics, election cybersecurity is a very wide, vastly growing field, and is a good opportunity for a lot of interesting jobs. I'll put a plug in for USF's cybersecurity program.
Okay. Let's take from him and we'll come to you.
you said that we are now turning towards a electronic voting system.
No, I said we turned away from it.
Oh.
What I was saying is after the 2000 election, it really looked like that was going to be what we were going to go to, touchscreen, because you could put multi-languages on it and everybody could use it. But we actually moved away from that. And I think there's only about 13 states now in the United States that still are using the touchscreen or the electronic voting. Everybody wants the paper voting.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear Florida has a good system for making sure the votes are true. I'm wondering if the same rules that are here in Florida, if they apply anywhere else. Is that like state oversight or federal oversight?
Well, actually kind of both, right? Every state has their own election laws. And, you know, that's what makes it interesting and difficult sometimes when we have all these retirees that come down here and they've done it a certain way in another state, and that's kind of ingrained in your brain, and you think that everybody does it the same way, and they don't. So they have different laws. For example, up in Massachusetts, they just started doing early voting. I think you still need an excuse for a vote by mail ballot in a lot of those northeastern states. I think New York, I think, started the early voting. And so, and then there are certain federal laws that everybody has to follow. The Help America Vote Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the having to do with the military, that affects us all. But the individual, are we going to have early voting? Are we going to have an excuse for this? What's going to be our restrictions as far as, are we going to have a photo ID? A lot of states don't even have any photo ID law. And you know, when you look at it, think about our world. Our world changes so much. We start out back in the old days, and you went to your polling precincts, neighborhoods were very stable, everybody knew everybody. We live in a pretty fast-paced world these days, and people are moving around. They say, there's a statistic I heard, between presidential elections, 25% of the voting population moves. So, you know, we've got a lot going on, and special circumstances that before were not looked at or felt deserving, and now we think, and rightly so, that everybody is deserving of consideration, and how are we going to accommodate voters with special problems, like the hurricane. You know, I mean, we have to bend over backwards for this. I mean, things happen like this. So, but not every state does it the same way.
So again, to add to that, so I was talking about the Voting Rights Act, which obviously is put a number of restrictions on states that would, you know, would have literacy tests, and so those have been nationalized, but there are some other differences. So until 1972 in the 26th Amendment, states could determine the age to vote. So in a lot of states, and I don't know if Florida was one or not, but in a lot of states, you had to do 21 to vote. In other states, it was 18. And then because a lot of 18-year-olds were being sent to Vietnam and fighting and unfortunately dying in Vietnam, there was this push to say, well, if you're old enough to fight in Vietnam, you should be old enough to vote. And so the Constitution was amended and said, all right, from now on, it's 18 for all states, regardless of what they want. And another example would be some states, so in Florida, except for when there was a hurricane, you can't register to vote after 30 days before the election. So anyone who wants to vote this coming election, if you haven't registered, you're out of luck. You can't vote because it's too late. Some states have same-day registration where you can just show up, register, and vote. And then we didn't, you know, this is a general election, but for primaries, states do a variety of different things. So in Florida, for example, you can't vote in the Democratic or Republican primary unless you are a registered Democrat or Republican. In some states, like in New Hampshire, you could go show up and you decide at that time which party you want to vote. Doesn't matter what party you're registered in, as long as you're registered. So for example, in Florida, if you're registered as no party, which is an option, or as or some states it's an independent, or you know, a small third party like the Libertarian Party or Green Party, you can't vote in our primaries. And that's entirely up to the state. And just one other point, quick point to make, you know, my wife and I, those traditionalists, that we've had the same house in South Tampa for 20 years, so we're not one of the frequent movers, and we like going on election day to the polling place. We usually time it, since we have a little more flexible schedules, to go in the middle of the morning, so you're going to miss the morning rush and the lunchtime and the afternoon rush. We walk to the polling place that's right down the street from us in South Tampa, and consider it kind of our civic responsibility. But that doesn't mean I'm not encouraging people to do early voting or mail-in voting, and whatever's easiest and gets people to vote. It's just for us, we feel it's sort of a civic kind of ritual for us to do that. And that's why I think we should adopt what a lot of other countries do, which is make election day a holiday, and that way I think would encourage more voting. Those of us who study voting, Americans, among all democracies in the world, have among the lowest voting turnout of all countries in a variety of different levels of democracy. In some countries, it's mandatory to vote. You can be fined if you don't vote and you're eligible. So in a lot of countries, it's really pushing more people to vote. In the United States, it seems like there are always these barriers that make it a little more difficult for people to vote.
Well, and if I could just say, because I think this is interesting, because of course I'm a supervisor of elections, so I think this is really interesting. And that is how we vote in Citrus County. And I'm talking about early voting, vote by mail, or election day. And as we kind of talked about, every state in this nation has its own personality, and so does every county. And I get down to the precinct level, and in different areas in Citrus County, they have their own personality of how they want to vote, what method they want to use. And we find that in the midterm elections, that most of the people will go to the polls. I'm looking at 2014, 43% went to the polls. Vote by mail was 34%, and 23% early voted. Now, when we got to the 2016 election, most of the people, 36% of the people, I don't say most, but percentage-wise, 36% of the people early voted. It kind of flip-flopped. And we have a steady number that vote at the polls. Those are our traditionalists, the Dr. Tauber here, who like to go to the polls, and we have a lot of those. And then vote by mail. We have over 31,500 people who have requested a vote by mail ballot for this election. That's a record. And so the thing that I hear every election that somebody will say, that's such an old myth, is that you only count the vote by mail ballots if it's a close election. Well, no. 31,000 of you, I don't think so. So we have 36% of them back as of Friday. So they're coming in, and there's a lot of people who like to vote by mail. Part of the situation is the ballot. We have some ballots out there, sample ballots, and we have 12 amendments on the ballot. So there's a lot to read. And so some people really like voting by mail, early voting, and so we're lucky. We have, here for this election, you can vote by mail. We have 72 hours of voting at an early vote site. 72 hours. And so we start on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday again, 10 to 6 at 4 early vote sites, Inverness City Hall, Central Ridge Library, Homosassa Library, and at the elections office in Meadowcrest that you can go to. So 72 hours of it, and then vote by mail, and then 12 hours on election day. So hopefully you can vote.
In Hillsborough, we have more early voting. We're a much bigger county, and African Americans in particular, when they are more likely to do early voting, and particularly on Sundays, there's a program that's called Souls to the Polls, where predominantly African American churches organize people after the service to go directly then to the early voting sites on Sundays. So when you watch the trends in early voting, you'll see, and in Hillsborough, today's the first day, and then there's some other counties where today's the first day for early voting, but you'll see the numbers really spike up, particularly on the weekends and especially on Sundays. And in fact, for those of us who like to predict elections or ask to predict elections, early voting numbers are a good sign for what the outcome of the election might be, because generally Democrats tend to prefer early voting. whereas Republicans tend to do more mail or in-person voting. You know, that's not obvious, you know, and not across the board. I'm a pretty liberal Democrat, we still like to go to the polls. But, you know, it is a good way to see, but one of the interesting things is we don't know when you're sending out the ballots to the non-party, the independents, they might be voting for the Democrat or Republican, or they might be voting for someone else, so there's a little bit of uncertainty there, but early voting is a good indication of how the vote might turn out.
One more question from the audience? Okay.
I know, I'm just wondering, like, I don't write the same signature twice, I believe, so how do you verify that it's the same signature?
Well, I would say, you know, we big. You're looking right at the person and you have a photo ID. So, you know, we're trying to make it as easy as possible, and I'm not going to get really nitpicky about that. If we're sure it's you, then we want to let you vote.
All right.